Dr. Daniel Amen is a psychiatrist, brain imaging expert, best-selling author, and medical director of the Amen Clinics. He has pioneered the use of brain imaging in clinical psychiatric practice and is a noted expert in the field of the brain and behavior. Dr. Amen's breakthrough research and insights provide hope and more effective treatment for millions of people today.
There are many people who are anxious or depressed or obsessive, prone to anger, they have attentional problems, and they thought their problems were all in their head, purely psychological, if you will. In the research that I've done, what we found is that these and many other problems are brain-based problems, and that when we optimize the brain, their lives become better. We often say, change your brain, change your life, and that's what we've seen. Today's lecture is actually fun, and I'm grateful for the brain food around. I was in a meeting last Friday. I was lecturing all day up in Eugene, Oregon, and they had donuts on the table ahead of time and bagels. And I'm like, why are you making me work this hard? Because if you have all simple carbohydrates, sugar, first thing in the morning, an hour later, how do you feel? You feel stupid. And what you eat matters. Part of what we're going to talk about today are what are the natural ways, and we'll talk about some unnatural, interesting ways to optimize brain function. Okay, so that's our goal today. And there are all sorts of ways to optimize brain function. Whenever you see a client or a patient, your first thought does not need to be Prozac. Or sometimes even your first thought may not be cognitive therapy. There's a whole bunch of different ways to optimize brain function. We're going to talk about some of them today. We call this natural ways to optimize the brain. Now there's great controversy. That's one of the reasons I love being a psychiatrist, because there's great controversy about everything you do. If you give a child medicine, that's horrible. If you don't give them medicine, it may be malpractice. Should you do psychotherapy? Does it really do anything? You bet. As we've seen, it changes brain function. But, natural treatments, now I'm thinking about supplements, vitamins, herbs, diet. It's a huge industry. If you look at the best-selling books over the last decade, the Atkins diet, South Beach diet, the brain chemistry diet, the Zone, Sugar Busters. It's like, what do you eat? These natural treatments change brain function. Very exciting. Many of them are positive. Many of them can be negative. So just because it's natural does not mean it's innocuous. That's very important to understand. And the big problem is, who's giving you consultations on St. John's wort? It's the 17-year-old who works at Walmart. I would submit this could be a bad idea, especially if these treatments impact brain function and you give it to the wrong person. Okay, so we're going to talk about what's called CAM, which stands for Complementary and Alternative Medicine. And your patients are doing this on their own in massive numbers. So you need to know a little bit about it. There's 7 different kinds of CAM. One, we call them mind-body interventions, okay, like biofeedback, relaxation therapies, meditation, hypnosis, imagery. Something called bioelectromagnetic therapies, using electricity or magnets. We'll actually talk a little bit about ECT. There's a lot of misinformation about ECT, and we'll talk about it. Something called vagal nerve stimulation, and this interesting thing called repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation. Very interesting. Alternative systems of medical practice. You've probably heard of osteopaths or DOs. DOs can do everything an MD can do. They just have a different system of training, which tends to be a little bit more holistic. And you've heard of acupuncture and homeopathy. Now, we're actually not going to talk about those things, but there are certainly things that can happen. All right. Manual healing methods. chiropractic, physical therapy, massage, pharmacological and biological treatments, like light therapy. You mean you can sit in front of a light for an hour or two in the morning, and that will actually have a physical, biological effect that can treat seasonal affective disorder? You bet. Or sleep deprivation. Deprive somebody who's depressed of sleep for a whole night. The next day they'll feel better. And then they're doing this thing called phase shifting therapy. So once you deprive them of sleep, the next day have them go to sleep at 5 o'clock in the afternoon and sleep till 1 o'clock at night. And then the next day from 6 to 2. And then the next day from 7 to 3. And what they find, it adds significant benefit to people who are depressed, whether they're taking medicine or not. I'm going, sleep deprivation. How can you do that long term? Right? I mean, don't you get psychotic if you don't sleep for 3 days. But they're finding when they do it in specific ways, it's helpful. We'll talk about the Irlen lens. It's such a cool treatment. We have to talk about that for a little bit. We're putting colored overlays on paper or wearing filtered lenses actually changes brain function and helps people read better, help people learn better. And we'll talk about HBOT, which is hyperbaric oxygen treatment. Put people in an oxygen chamber under more pressure than is normal in the atmosphere. Really drive oxygen into their bloodstream. Helps with wound healing, including brain wound healing. We'll talk a little bit about herbal medicine, plants and extracts. Although it's funny, I read in the paper this morning, I guess it was on the internet on Fox News Network, it's a woman who went in front of Congress recommending pot for ADD. You know, rather than these bad medicines, you can grow this in the back. I wonder, there's a doctor, she's probably growing it in the back. And, you know, that plants have power. And they can be harmful. So, and then we'll talk about diet and nutrition. So, some of the mind-body interventions are meditation. Well, we know meditation can change brain function. Well, the study from Andrew Newberg, who looked at Tibetan monks and Catholic nuns, he found that when they meditated, it actually increased activity in their frontal lobe. What does that mean? Concentration. They could focus better. So what you would think of as a spaced out, tuned out treatment is really tuned in, just tuned into yourself. We did a study on meditation where we did a specific form of meditation called Kriya Kirtan, where we actually showed that during this 12-minute meditation, activated the spiritual center in the brain, what we call the God spot, the right lateral temporal lobe. Brand new research study this week. Increased activity in that part of the brain, the part of the brain that is associated with spirituality and your sense of God, what we actually look for. It's part of our hypothesis in the God image study. So it activates the right lateral temporal lobe. That's where insight comes from. So maybe believing in God is insightful. What a thought. So just looking at our study on meditation, this is Dharma Singh Khalsa, the author of Brain Longevity, teaching me how to do it. And what we found, looking at these images, the blue indicates decreased activity. It actually happens in the left parietal lobe, so your sense of time and space goes down. But as we go toward the front part of the brain, what we see is concentration goes way up. So the red and yellow indicate increased activity in the frontal lobe and in the right lateral temporal lobe. So that's pretty cool. Bioelectromagnetic therapies, things like ECT. What's ECT? Well, where you pass an electrical current through somebody's frontal lobe. And what you do in ECT is actually induce seizures. Well, why the heck would you want to do that? Well, what they find is when they induce seizures, and they actually count seizure seconds to see, they count seizure seconds because above a certain threshold has an antidepressant effect, is that it is one of the most effective treatments for treating depression. One of the safest treatments for treating depression. And that's not one of the first things that you do because our society has the cuckoo's nest image of ECT or electric shock therapy. But for people who are suicidal that are not getting better, it is one of the things people should think about quickly. People go, well, aren't there side effects? Yes, especially how they used to do it. They used to do it by putting electrodes on both sides of your frontal lobes, or on your skull, and then really zapping you. Well, they've changed it. So now they do what's called unilateral, so they only do it on one side, and the incidence of side effects is significantly less. It's interesting, there are brain studies that show after ECT, there's significant increased activity, especially in the front part of the brain. And we know many people who are depressed have low activity in that part of the brain. So don't just dismiss ECT as barbaric. A lot of people do that without really understanding the literature behind it, which is very impressive. Well, what about these two new things? I mean, what's repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation? Well, when they were doing SPECT scans on depressed people, they found certain group had low activity in the front part of the brain. And they wondered, well, what are the other things we could do besides medicine to try and ramp up activity? So this group got together powerful magnets. And what they found is that when you passed a magnetic current through somebody's brain or over somebody's brain, it actually changed their scan. And in 50% of people with resistant depression got better. Now, it's one of the new things that you're going to hear about is the researchers are doing this. There are actually people starting to do this clinically. So there will be centers around the country of people who are magnetizing parts of your brain. And what they found, they can put this stimulation over your frontal lobes and turn them on, or they can change the threshold and turn them off. Isn't that interesting? And there are not that many side effects. You don't lose your ability to have an orgasm like you do with Prozac, Zoloft, Paxil, Celexa, Lexapro, Anafranil, and so on. And, you know, a lot of patients want to have more options than just medicine. There's another treatment technique called vagal nerve stimulation. That's where they actually go into your neck, find the vagus nerve. It's one of the 12 cranial nerves. They find it, and they put a little stimulator on it. And what the stimulator does is it stimulates the nerve and actually turns it off. And what they find is when they stimulate it, it decreases the frequency of seizures. And what they found is it increased people's moods. Isn't that interesting? So it's another thing they're using for refractory depression. Now the jury's still out on both of these. So if you read professional journals, there'll be these really cool positive articles on it and articles that say, you know, we have to be careful with these new technologies. Well, what are some of the pharmacological and biologic treatments? Sleep deprivation, as we talked about. There are a number of studies that say if you have a hot cingulate, now hopefully at this point, you all know what that means, which means you worry, you can't let go. Things don't go your way, you get really upset that you hold on to things, maybe hold grudges. That if you have that brain pattern, sleep deprivation helps you. So these are people you want to think of, not I'm depressed, go to bed and stay there. These are the people you want to get out of bed and make them do something. So maybe one night out of a month, no sleep, right? And some of you are close enough to being undergraduate students that you have experience with that, right? Actually, some of this is done at UC Irvine. A friend of mine, Joe Wu, who is the director of the PET Center at UCI, he's got a big grant to study this. And what they find is when they add sleep deprivation along with changing their sleep patterns, that they get statistically significant improvements above just what medicine will do for you. There's also something called light therapy, that you can buy these very powerful lights, and if you stay in front of them for an hour or two in the morning, it increases your mood, especially if you're affected by seasonal affective disorder. Now in Southern California, we don't have that much of it because we get the sun a lot. But in our clinic in Tacoma, Washington, we get a lot of it fact, I have a patient there. He's a 12-year-old boy, cute as can be, just a doll. And he'd been doing really well, and then I was up there recently, and like 4 months of being negative and not sleeping and being more irritable, and he had suicidal thoughts. And I'm going, oh, this is not Southern California. Is there a pattern to it? And there was a pattern of winter depressions in his family. So, you know, even though this is the end of April here, well, the end of April in many places is still winter if you think of northern climates. So light therapy in this one study actually found that it increased overall activity. Now, if you have a tendency to get blue in the winter, a simple thing you can do is go to Home Depot and get grow lights. What are grow lights? Grow lights are lights that are full spectrum that they use in greenhouses to raise certain kinds of plants. And just put them in your house. A lot of people, we'll see later when we talk about the Irlen lenses, a lot of people are very sensitive to fluorescent lights. They get headaches. Words will move on the page. They'll blur, shake, shift. And one of the things you can do is put colored overlays on them, as we'll see. But get rid of the fluorescent lights. Not for everybody, but for the people who are vulnerable to them. So, the Irlen lenses. Helen Irlen is a psychologist in Long Beach. And she's a school psychologist. And what she found was a lot of children were being diagnosed with ADD and dyslexia, and what they really had were visual processing problems. And so she came up with this whole system. They now have hundreds of centers worldwide doing what is the Irlen method. And the Irlen syndrome, or it's also named is scotopic sensitivity syndrome, these people are light sensitive. They're bothered by glare. That sunlight, headlights, street lights irritate them. Brighter fluorescent lights give them tiredness, headaches, mood problems. They get restless and they have trouble concentrating. They'll tell you they have trouble reading words that are on white or glossy paper. As I said, words will shift, shake, blur, move, run together, disappear, or become difficult to read. And if you never ask somebody, they won't tell you this. And so on our questionnaire, we actually screen everybody for this syndrome. They feel tense, tired, sleepy, get headaches with reading. And what's really interesting is they have problems with depth perception. They don't judge distance very well. And how you notice it is if you go to the mall with them. Now, most people, when there's an escalator, well, we see the escalator and we just walk on the escalator. Well, not these people. They go up to the escalator and they stop. I have a nephew who has this. We were in Las Vegas. We were at New York, I think. And it's like, come on, let's go upstairs. And I'm like my usual Energizer Bunny self, and I'm like running up the escalator. And he's down there going like this. At which point I'm going, Irlen syndrome. And he had headaches and trouble reading and all of those things. So when you see somebody who just doesn't walk on an escalator, think that this syndrome might be part of the issue. This is a woman, 42 years old, came to see us with what I call the Holy Trinity of the Amen Clinic, which is ADD, anxiety, and depression. It's the most common things people present with us. And the doctor she saw said she has scotopic sensitivity and sent her over to Dr. Irlen's clinic in Long Beach. And only by a random chance, if you believe in random chance, my sister is over there with my nephew getting screened. And my sister calls me on my cell phone. In fact, 3 times she called me. I didn't answer it, but it kept going off. And I'm like, she starts screaming. She says, you can't believe what happened. And she tells me about this woman who's so excited because she had never really, truly seen in 3D. And when she put the colored lenses on, the bookcase came out from the wall. The doorknob came out from the door. And she saw a guy walking by the door who was sort of round. And she goes, pot belly! And just blurts out that he had a pot belly, which was rude, but she'd never seen one before because she didn't see depth very well. And she was so excited, and Dr. Erlin called me because we had this before scan, and the only intervention were the lenses. For the after scan we did 4 days later, which was a dramatic calming of her brain. Well, you get pretty excited about that, right? Because this is a brain we would usually think of using a fair amount of medicine or supplements with. And the most interesting part of the story is, after she got better, she got worse. And Dr. Dobrin, one of the docs in my clinic, is going, she got really depressed afterwards. I'm going, okay, why? She said, well, like Paul Harvey does, the rest of the story. So Dr. Dobrin told me the rest of the story. When this woman was 12 years old, she was a prodigy guitar player. She was great. She would do concerts, and everybody was very excited about her potential. But the one thing she couldn't do was learn to read music. And the reason she couldn't learn to read music is the notes would dance on the page. And she could just never get it. And so at the age of 12, she took her guitar by the throat, crashed it into a wall, broke it, and never played again. Now, 30 years later, she's 42. She gets this diagnosis and gets this very cool treatment that makes her better and her brain better. So why is she depressed? She mourns the loss of what could have been. If somebody would have picked this up earlier in her life. Now, nobody was doing this earlier in her life. I mean, ultimately, you have to help people mourn the loss and then move on, which she was able to do. It's a very cool treatment. If you want to get more information on this, go to erlin.com, and you can take the screening test. You can learn about its connection to migraines, to reading problems, to autism, and so on. And my thought is, there's certain colors of the light spectrum for certain people where their brains are too sensitive, and it agitates and irritates them. What's hyperbaric oxygen treatment? Well, we put people into hyperbaric chambers. Under pressure, about 1.5 atmospheres with 100% oxygen. It's actually approved by Medicare. There's like 14 different indications for this. And it's mostly around wound healing. Now, few of the indications have to do with the brain, because people don't think that the brain can have a wound. Well, of course the brain can have a wound. And Richard Neubauer, who's one of the fathers of hyperbaric oxygen treatment for brain healing, sent me some of these cases and images. So this first one is a child who's 4 years old who has cerebral palsy. Has many developmental delays. He was diagnosed at 6 months, but not treated till he was 4. So we're 3.5 years until the time of treatment. And I got 150 treatments. It's a lot of treatments, going 4 or 5 times a week, for a long time. But afterwards, what they found, cognitively he was better, his gross motor skills were better, the spasticity was less, he was talking more and interacting more. Now, of course, my interest is, what does his brain look like? Well, if you look on the left, that's his scan before treatment. 150 treatments later, laying in a chamber for an hour, look at how much better the brain activity is. Now, how exciting is that? Very exciting. What about this case? It's a 41-year-old person who is totally blind because he got exposed to a lightning strike. Now, the time to treatment was 5 weeks. He'd actually been to a famous clinic, eye clinic in the Northeast that begins with an H, and they told him he would never see again. He had 59 treatments, and then he started to begin to see shadows where he wasn't seeing anything before. At 73 treatments, his vision was 20/25. Currently, he's working full-time, and no further therapy was required. Look at his scans. And what you see on the images on the left are holes in his occipital lobe. So that means there was tissue damage in the vision part of the brain. If you look at the image on the right, this is after 73 treatments. So I think it's a treatment that will be used a lot for people with strokes, for people who have toxic exposure, from drug abuse or from environmental toxins. And there are a number of clinics in Southern California that do this particular treatment. Well, what about herbs? Well, you know, herbs have been used for centuries. And plants make up the basis for a quarter to a half of all medicines. I mean, if we look at things like digitalis, comes from the foxglove leaf. Morphine comes from the poppy. There's a picture of a poppy. Aspirin, anticoagulants, anti-cancer medications often are found as medicinals from plants in nature. Now, the plant's therapeutic value, according to many people, is really not from one thing in the plant, but from a synergistic effect of many of the properties of the plants. Now, that's opposed to pharmaceuticals, where they isolate fluoxetine, the active ingredient in Prozac, and they're just getting that one thing. Now, there's all sorts of types of herbs that come from plants, like teas, powders, liquids, capsules, tablets, bulk plants, parts of plants, and that's actually one of the problems. It's the preparations are not the same. Like if you get St. John's wort, you might get 30 different preparations that have different things in them. 1976, Germany formed what they called their E Committee to evaluate complementary and alternative medicine strategies. They published 462 monographs looking at 360 herbs, 391 preparations of herb parts, and approximately 2/3 they found significant benefit enough for them to recommend use. The United States has been slower. Some people, I don't know who, think it has to do with the power of the pharmaceutical lobby. And if you don't think pharmaceutical companies have anything to do with how medicine is practiced, they fund about 70% of the studies in medical schools nationwide. They are a huge lobby. And if you just look at the number of pharmaceutical reps that come into my clinic, you know, on a regular basis, I mean, you really have to be careful with the level of influence that they wield in psychiatry. Despite that, in 1990, 60 million Americans were using complementary and alternative medicine. The annual visits to a complementary and alternative practitioner exceed the annual visits to doctors. 1991, 34% of the U.S. population had used herbal meds. 1999, it increased to 40%. Probably now it's over 50%. If you look at the number of people using ginkgo or SAMe or St. John's wort or fish oil, only 28% of physicians are informed about its use. Only 6% use it. And I teach the class on supplements at UC Irvine in the psychiatric residency program. And it's amazing to me the negative bias the students have starting it. And you can already see the influence of the drug companies. It's like, oh, these things don't work. Well, it's like, do you read? If you read the literature without having a knee-jerk negative reaction, if you just read it, well, you get actually very impressed that these things work often as good as pharmaceuticals. So why would somebody think about going to the health food store or going to the health food section of the grocery store? Well, because healthcare is pretty expensive. Because they're frightened by the side effects of medication. They want something natural. I call this the Marin, Oregon effect. You know, the people from Marin, that's a county north of San Francisco, they like wear sandals and they want to be one with the natural universe. They're much more interested in trying something natural. We have lots of those patients who come to see us. They have friends that responded. They saw ads on in the media somewhere. They don't trust pharmaceutical companies. And the complementary and alternative medicine practitioners are often viewed as more patient-oriented, rather than now in the age of managed care where docs need to see 5, 7, 8 people an hour. they feel like these people spend more time. And I can't tell you the therapeutic impact of bonding with your patients and your clients. If you are rushed, they feel anxious and tense. They transfer that to you, and they don't have quite the level of trust in you. And I have to tell you, trust is healing. People believe in you, and you believe in what you're doing, they're likely to get better. These are just some characteristics of the people who are more likely to use alternative medicine. Higher education. So this is not for the dummies of the world. Higher education and income. Sicker. More holistic orientation. They've had some form of a transformational experience. So how many of us in this room have had a transformational experience? Most of us, given that, here at a Christian college. Right? So you find the incidence of this among Christian populations pretty high. They have anxiety, back problems, pain, or urinary tract infections. If they're into personal growth, feminism, spiritual practice, environmentalism. So people who tend to believe. So some of the issues related to cost, to bring a new medicine to market takes 15 years and $500 million. You want to go through the FDA process. There's also patent issues. 1996, the Europeans spent $7 billion. The U.S. was $3.24 billion on complementary and alternative medicine. A lot of because you cannot get a patent on St. John's wort, right? Because it's been around for a long time. It's not something new or novel. Because you can't get a patent on it, it's not worth it for people to spend the big bucks to study it and to bring it to market as a pharmaceutical. Why would I want to do it? I tell you, I work with supplements all the time with my patients because I like them. And, what are the benefits of trying a supplement before you try Prozac? You never have to tell an insurance company you took it. Do you think taking psychotropic medications affects your insurability? You bet it does. If they found you're on Prozac, they may not give you health insurance 10 years from now because they know because you had depression, you're at a higher risk of having more medical problems. Now, we might think that's unfair, but that's the reality. If you took Ritalin as a child, that might affect your insurability later on. If you're still taking Ritalin, they won't let you in the military. Right? Now, how stupid is that? You can have ADD, and as long as you're not being treated, you can go fight. Or you can be a pilot for United Airlines and have ADD as long as you're not being treated. Whew. Makes me nervous. I'm going to Philadelphia tomorrow. Okay, so you never have to tell an insurance company you took them. They're less expensive. They generally, not always, but generally have significantly fewer side effects, but not no side effects. They're often effective for mild to moderate problems. You have somebody who has schizophrenia, do not just put them on fish oil, please. Or you have somebody who has bipolar disorder who just spent the whole family fortune. Fish oil and GABA will not do it, is my experience. So, for mild to moderate problems, that's what you need to be thinking of these things for. And they have better compliance. Why? Because they have fewer side effects. Are there downsides to using supplements? You bet. Even though they're less expensive, they may be more expensive for you because insurance companies don't cover them. Many are not aware that they have potential side effects and can, in fact, make you worse. Quality control is a huge issue. There are some brands, when they study them, they only have a tenth of what they say that is actually supposed to be in there. And there are fewer studies because it's hard to maintain patents on them. So I believe in informed consent. To tell people what their different treatment options are, what's the pro, what's the con, and you decide. Now, if I've done a good job bonding with my patients, almost always they go, Dr. Amen, if this was your mother, what would you do? Dr. Amen, if this was your daughter, what would you do? And then I would tell them what I would do. And, I push people in certain directions because I have more experience. So if it's really a serious problem, I'm going, I just don't think supplements will work, but it's an option. Quality control, it's a big issue. You need brands that you trust because there's lots of variability. Rigid quality control is not required because these are not really watched by the FDA. And there's variabilities like plant part, the age, the ripeness, when it was harvested, the growing environment. There's lots of variabilities, and there could be contamination with pesticides, with other microorganism toxins. I mean, you might remember, 10 years ago, that tryptophan was pulled from the market. Tryptophan is a naturally occurring amino acid. But they pulled it from the market because there was a bad batch from Japan that caused a certain problem that killed a number of people. Okay? So you need brands you trust. Different components of the herb can do different things, and they're drug-drug interactions that often are not studied. They can actually decrease the effectiveness of birth control pills. They can this could be a problem in somebody's family, right, if you don't talk to them about that. It's a wonderful website that has really solid information about alternative medicines, and it's called consumerlab.com. And it actually does independent studies of the different herbal products and go, Nature's Way, St. John's wort, has what it says it has in it. Or Jarrow Sammy. I mean, you can look up certain brands. So if we get to some of the brands, St. John's wort is one of my favorite. It's been used to treat depression, dysthymia, anxiety, sleep disorders, worrying, people who overfocus. Hypericin, along with other things, are thought to be the active ingredient of it. Peaks in 5 hours, has a half-life of 25 hours, which means you only really have to take it once or twice a day. And it reaches its steady state in the body in about 4 days, which means you will not see the effect right away. They think it works by inhibiting the breakdown of a number of different substances, but norepinephrine and serotonin are one of them. Clinically, I see it works just like an SSRI. I mean, it makes your frontal lobes less active, so it'll make you happy and stupid. Now, if you take just the right amount, it'll make you less anxious and less depressed, and you'll be cognitively intact. Take too much St. John's wort, and you'll be like one woman in one of our studies that said, I'm happier, but I'm dingier. 25, okay? Physicians' knee-jerk reaction to this is there's no studies. 25 double-blind studies with over 2,000 people showing improved mood. More effective than placebo and comparable to standard antidepressants for mild to moderate depression. Better side effect profile than standard antidepressants. Now, not no side effects, but in one study, St. John's wort, 20% of people had side effects. And the standard antidepressant, more than half of them had side effects. So now you're really thinking about compliance. You know, in a new study, there's a 1.5% dropout rate versus a 3 to 12% dropout rate. So at least half of the dropout rate. There's one study published in 2001 with the 2,166 patients. 446 physicians participated in the study. They used doses of 600 to 1,200 milligrams a day for moderate depression. 600 milligrams a day, 83% of people got better. 1,200 milligrams, 88% of people got better. Tolerance was good. The typical dose that people give is 300 milligrams 3 times a day. For me, nobody remembers to take something 3 times a day. I have 300 in the morning, 600 at night, or 600 in the morning, 300 at night. You know, you're lucky if you get somebody to take something twice a day. Do not take it if you're taking an SSRI. If you're taking Prozac, Paxil, Zoloft, Celexa, Lexapro, don't do it because you can get too much serotonin and get sick from it. St. John's wort increases sun sensitivity. You're more likely to burn on it. It can induce a certain enzyme system and lower the effectiveness of antivirals, of immunosuppressants, of anticoagulants, heart medicines, and birth control pills. They actually found that or discovered that in many AIDS patients who were depressed, who took St. John's wort. Well, their antiviral medicines didn't work as well. So potentially, that's a life or death thing if somebody has AIDS. So you just need to know who's it good for, who's it's not good for. Okay? Just because it's natural does not mean it's innocuous. This is a scan of a woman before and after on St. John's wort. And what we see on the left, increased cingulate activity at the top, increased basal ganglia and limbic activity after St. John's wort. This is a month later. That's very impressive. And that's our experience. And we have about 15 people we've scanned before and after. Well, what about ginkgo? What is ginkgo? It's an herb from the ginkgo biloba tree. They found that this herb, which has been used for centuries, increases cerebral blood flow. It has certain active ingredients, flavonoids, and terpenoids. And what it is, it's a free radical scavenger. Free radical formation is one of the mechanisms of nerve cell death. It inhibits something called platelet activating factor. You do not want your platelets activated. Why? Because when your platelets are activated, they clump. I mean, that's what platelets do. They stop bleeding. So you don't want them clumping because as platelets clump, it decreases blood flow. Just think of it as you have these clumps, these wads of paper, if you will. Think of it like that going through the pipes. And it blocks things. So if you decrease platelet activating factor, it can increase blood flow throughout the brain. Also increases GABA levels, which helps calm down overactivity. And it increased receptors in the hippocampus, which we know is one of the major memory centers in the brain in rats. Used for cerebral insufficiency, dementia, fatigue, tinnitus, or ringing in your ears. There is a 24-week randomized placebo-controlled study with 156 patients who showed 38% were improved versus 18% on placebo. LaBarre is probably the most famous study, published in JAMA in 1997 with 202 patients. People had Alzheimer's disease or something called multi-infarct dementia, dementia based on strokes, showed significant improvement compared to placebo, 37% versus 23%. Now, if you compare it to Aricept, one of the acetylcholinesterase inhibitors, one of the medicines for Alzheimer's disease, well, Aricept wins. But Aricept is also a lot more expensive and has some side effects. Now, not many. Aricept's a great drug. But I take a ginkgo every day. I like the idea of increasing blood flow to my brain. Now, there's one case. If you have a bleeding disorder, you probably shouldn't take ginkgo, because there's one case of a 70-year-old man that had prolonged bleeding. Another case of a 33-year-old woman. Sometimes people say hiccups are rare. Side effects, sometimes a rash or headaches. The dose is usually 60 to 120 milligrams twice a day. And the two brands I like are Ginkgoba and Gink Gold because they have very high quality. Now, I like Nature's Way St. John's wort. That's the one I usually tell my patients to get. There's another interesting supplement called valerian. Comes from the root of the valerian plant. It's been used to treat insomnia. In fact, something you should absolutely think of before you think of some of the anti-anxiety sleep medications like Restoril. It's involved with GABA receptors, which means it's settling things down. And the dose is really wide, 500 milligrams all the way up to 12 grams. And there's a number of studies that show its effectiveness. It's another supplement. This is probably one of my favorite ones. And it's called SAMe, stands for S-adenosylmethionine. It's been indicated for depression and pain. So you get somebody that comes to your office and they have fibromyalgia or they have a chronic pain syndrome and they're depressed. For me, I think of using this first. There's 40 studies, over 1,400 patients. SAMe is actually produced by all your cells. It's a methyl donor. What that means is it increases the availability of other neurotransmitters in the brain. Found in one study to be less toxic but equally as effective as imipramine. The dose is 200 to 1,600 milligrams a day. So again, really wide. So I usually start with 200 milligrams twice a day. And I'll do that for a month. And then I'll go up to 400 milligrams twice a day and do that for a month. And I'll go up to 600 milligrams twice a day. And I have a lot of people who say it's effective. And they move better. Their joints are better. They're less tense. Now, it can cause insomnia. And there's actually a couple of cases reported in the literature. If you're bipolar and you take SAMe, it may flip you. So, you just can't give it to everybody. But can you see why somebody's going to the health food store? They have bipolar disorder, and now they're in a depressive phase. And they just take SAMe, it might flip them. And they might kill themselves. Or they might kill somebody else. Or they might get heavily involved in drugs. And nobody in the whole history of this person's evaluation after they got into trouble goes, what else were you taking? Because often when I say, what are you taking? They don't talk about this stuff. Because they don't think of it as important. They don't think of it as medicine. We have walnuts here today. Walnuts are high in omega-3 fatty acids. Well, omega-3 fatty acids have been found to be low in ADD, low in depression, and low in Alzheimer's disease. They've also been found in studies to be helpful for mood stability, in bipolar disorder, and in pregnant women who are depressed. But use good stuff. Use pharmaceutical-grade omega-3 fatty acids. There are a couple of components, DHA, we think, which is best for the brain, EPA, good for your heart. They're also good for your skin. So heart, skin, eyes, brain. Why not? Now, some people say if you eat a lot of fish, well, you're getting enough omega-3 fatty acids. In fact, if you eat probably 1 or 2 servings a week, it's really helpful. The problem is the more fish you eat, the more mercury you're going to get from the fish. And so you want to find the best quality omega-3 fatty acids, and just prevention, take about 1,000 milligrams a day. If you have somebody you're really worried about a mood disorder and you want to enhance how their medicine works, about 4,000 milligrams a day. But some of the good brands I like, Omega Bright, Nordic Naturals, we actually sell that in our clinic, and Core Omega, which is this very cool stuff for kids because it tastes like orange pudding. So there's no fish burps with it. And it can be very helpful. Numbers of studies on it. Studies showing that omega-3 fatty acids are low in ADD, that supplementing them, this was the famous study by Andrew Stahl, that had longer remissions in people with bipolar disorder. As an add-on treatment, it improved depression in another study. Help people with borderline personality disorder. You mean that's a brain disorder? Well, of course it is, right? People don't act that way because they're more successful in life. One of my favorite scans, this was a kid who had, we call it the ring of fire. And this is a combination. This is before treatment. After treatment, this was GABA, which is an inhibitory neurotransmitter that you can buy over the counter, and St. John's wort together. I mean, it's just cool how it works sometimes. Well, what about diet? Does diet make a difference? Well, I think we've talked about that some. Feed your brain. What does that mean? Lean protein, complex carbohydrates, decrease the simple sugars, bad fat, but not all fat because 60% of the solid weight of your brain is fat. So you think of what are things I can eat to increase omega-3 fatty acids? Cold water fish, tuna, salmon, walnuts, Brazil nuts, and when you cook, cook with olive oil or canola oil. These are the 14 best foods. There's a wonderful book called Superfoods, and they talk about the benefit of these. But basically, if you eat this way, think of putting one of these foods or something in the same food group in your diet on a regular basis. It will be extraordinarily helpful. So blueberries, beans, broccoli, oranges, oats, pumpkin. Now, this is not pumpkin pie. pumpkin squash, soybean, salmon, spinach. You can never go wrong with spinach. Tea, tomatoes, turkey, walnuts, and yogurt. And this book, Superfoods, this goes into great detail on the science behind why these are better. Now, I recommend a lot to my patients. You have a sleepy brain, higher protein, lower carbohydrate diet. So something like Sugar Busters or South Beach, or you really want to lose a lot of weight, Atkins, but I don't really like Atkins long term. If you have a hot cingulate, you don't want to eat a diet that's going to make you concentrate, because you'll concentrate more on the things that irritate you. So there's a wonderful book called Potatoes, Not Prozac that teaches you how to eat in a way to boost serotonin levels in the brain. There's actually a diet, the Atkins diet, and some of these others are ketogenic diets, that you eat so few carbohydrates, you burn fat, which produces ketone bodies. Well, they found that actually people do lose weight, they concentrate better, and it decreases the seizure frequency in children who have seizures. Isn't that cool? Just try to eat healthy protein. The American diet is killing us. I mean, I don't know how else to say it. How we feed children is a scandal. How we feed ourselves is a scandal because we're running so fast. There are ways to eat in a balanced way in fast food restaurants. Like have Wendy's chili that don't have fries or Coke. We have Wendy's chili and water. It's perfectly balanced. Or you get a Jack in the Box, have a chicken fajita pita. Again, it's balanced between carbs and protein, but you can't have the fries, the onion rings, or the Oreo milkshake, right? That unbalances it. All right, exercise, I mean, I can't tell you. You want a natural treatment to balance brain function? Get them to exercise. Half an hour a day, increase their heart rate. Cognitive abilities are better, increases DNA cell repair, blood flow, oxygen, glucose metabolism is better. The brain's protected against molecules that hurt it. I mean, it's just all good. Improves, it decreases your risk for Alzheimer's disease if you exercise. How your brain uses insulin is better. How neurons respond to stressful events is better. And it actually keeps your blood vessels round by increasing a compound called nitric oxide. So exercise is probably one of the best natural things that you can do. So if you look at all of these treatments, there are many, many ways to balance your brain. And one of your goals should always be helping get your clients or your patients their best brain possible. It's got to be the goal, right? Because when your brain works right, you work right. And when your brain doesn't, there's trouble.